That's great. Can you share a little bit of what maybe those conversations have been at ZETA with utilities and what you're hearing and seeing kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I think ultimately there's a lot of lessons I think learned from the abject failure that the Texas ERCOT and communities all over Texas really suffered from. I think the most important thing to think about is we have the ability, and I think this is just a baseline. We have the ability to serve a load, from the power sector to consumers. It is a built architecture. It exists all over the country. It is a very efficient way to deliver fuel to heat people's homes, to certainly to power their vehicles and to power our economy. What happens is human error. And I think that's ultimately what happened in Texas. There was a failure to winterize, to some degree. I think it was a distinct minority, but a failure to winterize some of the wind turbines. But by and large, this was such a cold snap that wellheads for the natural gas and other sorts of applications that pull up water along with gas and oil and others froze. And I think the numbers that I've seen showed that 80% of the failure was actually related to hydrocarbons, not renewable energy, and not a failure of the actual the grid. It was just a generation failure. And so to me, if I'm a Texan, the lesson that I take away from that is, one, hey, I'd sure like to be a part of a regional grid and not have a island that I live on for my power sector. Number one. Number two, and I think many people are thinking about this is, what can I do to have a more resilient personal power experience? And I think distributed energy, whether that's wind or solar, or certainly a solar plus storage is one way to do that. I think certainly if you look at the peak pricing in a really competitive market like Texas, there are people that got $8,000 utility bills. And so at that price point, it can make a lot of sense to make investments in solar panels or retail residential storage capacity. And then that begs the question of how does the car fit in? And, there is some ability to do vehicle to home for power. I think there's probably greater potential for vehicle to grid. So let's say, this was the summer and you have 50,000 idled electric school buses that have, strong battery packs in them. There's a way to draw on, certainly at peak times, the energy from those stationary, medium, and heavy duty vehicles, and to even some extent light duty vehicles to serve the grid. And so I think that's part of the potential here is that the more penetration we have with electrification, the more resilient we can make the grid in a host of ways. And part of that was made possible by a recent FERC order, which was FERC Order 2222, which allows us to aggregate that power and sell it onto the wholesale market. And so that's a potential for your battery, not necessarily to be constantly cycling and feeding the grid, but your battery at those peak times when power spikes from $15 a megawatt hour to 300 or to 500, to provide some resiliency to the grid. And certainly if I'm a Texan and I've got a variable rate, when those prices peak, it sure will be a benefit for them to have some storage at the residential setting. So I think it is going to get people thinking about their needs and solutions in more creative ways. But I think, by and large, I think you're going to see some reforms in Texas because, again, I think most of the failure here was human. I mean, it was certainly a natural disaster and a natural challenge, but again, it was human failure that led to this.
Well, and I think not to make it sound like we're completely picking on Texas, this is something you're seeing even with I'm on the West Coast, so we're seeing it with obviously the wildfires. They're different kind of natural and kind of man-made elements playing into this, but the need for more distributed grid as well as kind of just more resilient is definitely a big trend we're seeing just across the country. You mentioned kind of the example of medium duty and someone who kind of works with a lot of these different manufacturers. I'm curious what your discussions have been and where you're seeing the examples of maybe vehicle to grid pilots start? Because it does seem, and in my personal opinion, it does seem like the most common and what's going to make the most sense to start with, at least, is probably going to be on the medium and heavy duty side with fleets versus on the light duty, just due to warranty concerns and other things like that. What, have you been kind of seeing similar trends, or are there any other kind of conversations you've been having with manufacturers that are kind of changing those thoughts?
Well, so I think the important thing, and this is why I think FERC Order 2222 is important, is that it provided for an aggregated, sale to play in the capacity markets and receive an ancillary service payment for either a positive or negative load that you're able to provide the grid. And so, I think the important thing, to me, I think the biggest potential is vehicle to grid for that reason. And I think vehicle to home is a little more difficult. That constant cycling, I think there is some worry about degradation, and what does that do over time? Does your battery range get impacted in ways that it otherwise wouldn't? I think that's what, you've got manufacturers that aren't dying to have their cars used in a way they didn't intend and have that impact range and their brand reputation. But, certainly a twice, maybe 3 times a year pull, from your battery in a two-way charging to be aggregated and deliver either a positive or negative load to the grid makes a lot of sense. And I think, you get paid a capacity payment, you get paid for the energy if you deliver it, but you also get paid an ancillary service. And so if you can aggregate that, I think it's actually a real value to the consumer and can help them, net out the economics of going electric. The other thing that I think is, really an interesting part of, the negative load essentially is, most people in the summer are going to come home, they're going to plug in their car and turn on their AC at the same time. And if you have a level 2 charger, most people are going to, reach their capacity limit on their battery in an hour or two. Maybe it's 4 hours, but that doesn't need to be between 6 and 10 at night. It can be between, midnight and 4 a.m. And so I think some management of when you charge and having that be part of the equation, so that you can, have a relationship with the grid that, again, could provide a positive load at times, but certainly in a kind of a demand response space, ensure that at those peak times, that you're coordinating your energy flow in a way that makes economic sense for you. The other thing that I tend to think about is, if you're running one of these vehicle to grid or an aggregated program, there's a way for, consumers, let's say, you're going to go do a regional analysis and you're going to figure out when do those peak demands happen. And, most likely it's going to be the same hour or two of the day throughout the year, maybe 2 or 3 times. And so if you have some arrangement where you're aggregating a bunch of consumers that are willing to be, committed to having their car plugged in for a period of time, again, maybe that's light duty, maybe it's a school bus fleet, maybe it's municipal vehicles. There's a real potential there to, create hundreds of millions of dollars of utility scale storage capacity just by coordinating human beings and how we behave. And so I think that's a really cool opportunity for people to make money and for us to make the grid more resilient.
That's great. I think.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to visit our website, connectingthegrid.com. There you can listen to our podcasts, contact us about sponsorship, or even be a guest on Grid Connections. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a positive rating on your favorite podcast or video streaming service. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out a lot too. Thank you again, and I look forward to us learning more together soon.